And
Mhm.
I sometimes have this perspective. It goes back to what you were saying about like what the label even means anymore, which is I actually feel strongly that I sometimes feel sad that as a how do I articulate this? It goes back to the sectarianism. I feel sad that anybody has surrendered on one side or claimed on the other side ownership of Jesus, who he was, and the example he set. What I mean by that is
Mm.
I, as somebody who kind of believes in sort of the perennial tradition, the wisdom tradition, I think of Jesus as a perfect exemplar of that. And I would say
Mhm.
that it's like you said, the only reason I wouldn't self-identify as a Christian is because that was not my path in, and it's not my main form of practice, but also it's because of the sort of the doctrine and ideology and the rhetoric of some of the people who have claimed that label. So I'm like, okay, you guys duke it out and figure it out, call yourselves whatever you want, but I don't think I guess what I'm saying is the Jesus that I encounter when I read the New Testament, from my perspective, oftentimes the people who are the best followers, some are Christian, some are Muslim, some are Buddhist, and some are Jewish. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
And so I'm
Yeah.
like, and I don't feel, it's like I don't think that they sometimes talk to me as if like, well, we own him. We own him because he fits our doctrine. Well, he actually fits my doctrine too.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, and I don't
Yeah.
have to,
Yeah.
your doctrine's not normative for me.
Yuri,
Thanks for
thank you
having
for
me.
coming on today, man. I'm stoked to talk to you. So we met through Instagram.
Yeah.
You had reached out, you saw one of the videos, and was talking to me about a show that you've recently been on called The Chosen.
Mhm.
What was your character? What was your role?
So on the Chosen, it's actually kind of a funny story. I auditioned to play King Herod, who on the show is that role is being performed by Paul Ben Victor, and he's doing a fantastic job. Like actually some of my favorite scenes. So it's not one of those situations where like they cast the right guy. But I really went for it in that audition and I didn't get that part. It went to Paul Ben Victor. And then they called me a few weeks later and they just offered me this other role that I didn't audition for. And as an actor, it's always like quite flattering to just be offered a role, and it means they liked my audition even though I wasn't right for that. But it was only one scene and two lines. So this was in season 4 and I remember talking to my reps. I'm like, I don't this is confusing to me. Like it's not about being like self-aggrandizing, but like based on where my career is, that was like a smaller part than I had been doing.
Sure.
So there was a debate like, oh, should I even accept this? And we had a dialogue with the casting director, and the casting director was like, no, Dallas, he puts a lot of thought into these things. If he's asking you to do this role, there's no guarantees, but they kind of hinted like you should try it. And then that role grew in season 5 and grew again in season 6. And so I am really glad. And so I play this character named Shimon, who is it's a little bit unclear in the show whether or not I am the son or the grandson of Hillel. So Hillel is one of the most famous rabbis in all of Jewish history. And it was a really thrilling part to dig into because it propelled me on this road of like I was born Jewish. So it propelled me to sort of dig into some of my roots that I hadn't looked at in a while and to really engage with Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity and Jewish mysticism
Mm.
and yeah, and just to make this answer short, that this character, one thing that they're doing on the show that I really admire is they are not just making the Jews out to be these kind of like classic, mustache or in this case beard twirling villains. They are
Yeah.
really presenting a much more complex and nuanced version of Second Temple Judaism, which means of course there were some Pharisees who were opposed to Jesus and his disciples. But there are also Pharisees that, like my character, who don't feel that way. who are very interested in hearing more and engaging with him. And, it's a more accurate reflection of what Judaism of the day was like. It wasn't this monolithic thing that is sometimes presented in sort of more, I'd say, simplified Christian narratives of like the Jews believed this and then Jesus came along and did this. It's like modern Christianity today. There's, thousands of denominations of Christianity and they don't all
Right.
always agree. And Judaism was full and vibrant and a complex spectrum as well. And so my character is more on the pro Jesus side of that. Um,
Right.
and so that's been really interesting for me.
Now, when you took this role, you said so you grew up Jewish, and then you expressed to me, and I've seen some of your other work where you teach you talk about Dharma, you talk about the Buddhist practice, you talk about Tantra a little bit, which
Mhm.
we're gonna get into all that, which
Yep.
is which is exciting because it's like I feel like you had this background, you're a
Yep.
Harvard grad, you
Yep.
studied sociology,
Social
um,
anthropology.
social anthropology. Okay, yeah, which
Other
includes.
universities call it cultural anthropology. So it's like the anthropology that's like focused on other cultures.
Okay. So, and then what method of acting did you study? Like, did you study acting at school? Did you just fall into acting? Like, was this just something that you were like, hey, I'm good at this, so I'm going to try to audition for things? Or how did that, how did you even get to this place where you're auditioning for things?
Okay. I'll try to make a long story short. I in high school I was really math and sciences. Well,
Yeah.
I'm going to backtrack a little bit. My father's an immigrant, immigrated post-war from Poland. I ended up at thanks to my parents, I ended up at kind of a fancy private high school. And my freshman year, I had an elective and I took an acting class and I got an A. So this is high school. And I got an A in this acting class and I came home and showed my report card and my dad he said, "Oh, that's great. Now take a real class." Like with a pat on the back.
Very typical. Yeah. The
Yeah, I mean,
very,
immigrant, I totally get it. My dad's a
yeah.
doctor and it didn't even Trey, it didn't even hurt my feelings. I
Yeah.
just was like, I clocked it as like, "Oh, well, that doesn't count." So, and my high school had a great theater department and I never acted again
Yeah.
through all of high school. So I get to college and my freshman year, I'm in like a chemistry class, a bio class, a calculus class, and there were certain days in the winter I literally wasn't seeing the sun because I'd be in the lab, like back to back labs, and I was just really unhappy my freshman fall. And one of the beautiful things about college is you meet people from all different walks of life. And one of my friends, or a guy who became a friend, had done a lot of high school theater, and so we had been talking about that, and I think I passed a class, but I failed a final because I'd stopped going to the class because I just couldn't bear. It was a math class. And I knew I needed to change. And he's like, "Oh, well, why don't you come to common casting?" Which was like Harvard's version of like just the open casting because at the time, there was no undergraduate drama department. You could take some classes, but it was basically just a theater club, the Harvard Radcliffe Dramatic Club. So
Yeah.
I had for my first show because it was something I always loved and thought I could do. And, then over the course of my time in college, I ended up doing like 11 shows, usually like one or two per semester. And slowly by slowly, I was like, well, this is fun. Oh, I really like doing this. Maybe I actually want to try to do it. I spent some summers, doing theater related stuff. And then I was like, I think I actually want to try to pursue this. And my parents like had a freaking meltdown. Am I allowed to swear on this podcast?
Yeah, man. Yeah. Of
Yeah.
course.
My parents had a fucking meltdown, but they dealt with it. And then after college, I moved to LA. So I didn't realize till I got to LA that how little I understood or knew how to act. But I didn't feel comfortable like trying to get my folks to pay for graduate school. So
Yeah.
I basically built my own acting program because in the acting world, there's graduate schools. There's undergrad, there's graduate schools, and there's also just like conservatories, right? Like you can go
Yeah.
become a chef because it's like a craft. So I
Yeah.
built my own grad program I studied with some master teachers like Patsy Rodenberg and Larry Moss and Bob Krakauer and a bunch of others. And so I kind of built my acting program while I was in LA. And I was there until about 2006. And then I came to New York, which is where my career really started to get going. And
Yeah.
then I was in New York for,
Interesting.
yeah.
Took off in New York. Now, okay, so what was your spiritual practice? I mean, did you have a spiritual practice? Like, were you someone that like I mean, was that a part of this, or what did you come into it after you moved to LA and you realized how were you like praying, "Oh, hey, God, I need," like
Yeah, you're kinda
I don't know.
close. No, it's a really great question. I would say now they're in many ways unified. My spiritual
Sure.
practice and my acting work is there's a certain very close alignment. At the time, no. At the time in LA, young, insecure, obsessed with trying to like be successful and make a name, but facing rejection and failure and definitely having some spiritual longing. And I had gone to temple growing up. I had definitely felt deep spiritual longing, but had never made like a deep, I'd say, authentic connection. And but art in itself is its own spiritual practice. And we can come back to
Yeah.
Buddhism later, but I definitely also had certain seeds that were there. Like, you know, you can laugh at this, but I always loved that movie, The Karate Kid. I always loved growing up, like, that relationship between Luke and Yoda. So I was always drawn to, like, healthy teacher-disciple relationships, and that was
Yeah.
mirrored in the way that I started to learn acting. Like, in LA, there's a lot of fucking fraudsters and scamsters. So you have these experiences with, like, these completely charlatan teachers who are just out to, like, get money from desperate actors, but then you
Yeah.
also have these amazing master teachers who are really committed and devoted to passing on this like tradition of knowledge of acting and to really watch their students like grow and thrive.
Yeah.
So I really learned how you can kind of mm, precisely decipher between those two.
Yeah.
And the but the real deep dive didn't happen till I had moved to New York, and I can get into that if you want, but I'm conscious
Well,
that I don't.
it sounds like you had a sensibility towards the this archetypal awareness of like these relationships where it was
Yep,
not so much about like this overarching God concept, but more about the nuanced of relationality with spirituality maybe, and then you kind of like, because I mean I think that's interesting what you're saying of like seeing these images. And I've had other people say this, like one of my closest friends talks about, he said, I didn't grow up with the Bible, I grew up with Star Wars.
mhm,
And he talks about how that his mythology was wrapped up into Star Wars, but it was so powerful because that mythology didn't live for him in just belief systems. It lived in the interactions of relationships of the people that he saw, exactly what you just mentioned. So I'm trying to get this understanding. Um, you know,
100%.
growing up, was there any other foundation? Like, did you like? Was it a smooth transition into like, because I mean, a lot of people will go through periods of deconstruction where they have to, like, walk away from some kind of religious programming or something that has like shaped their view of God. Was there anything like that, or was it just kind of a smooth transition
It
into?
it's a great question, and it ties to this thing that like so I grew up a Reform Jew, and so Reform Judaism is so it's so close to humanism, right? Like,
Hmm.
it's already not a literalist
Hmm.
interpretation of the Torah or the Old Testament, and I always grew up basically feeling very culturally Jewish, but the religious aspect felt actually disconnected always from what my family and my community believed. So it felt like it was some of these rituals and prayers were still things that we did out of like legacy connection, but not because they had a deep spiritual meaning, at least not to me. And in fact, I would argue that it was almost off putting in the sense that sometimes at that level, it's like these
Too
conceptions of
humanist?
God. Huh?
Or sorry, continue.
No, no.
Say what
What
you
were
were
you
saying.
gonna say?
You
What?
said too humanist, maybe, or too like.
Or no, the conceptions of God were too like just almost like old man in the sky, right? Like
Oh, on that side, yeah, yeah, yeah,
on
yeah.
that side. And so
I get what you're saying.
and it wasn't until later actually that I learned there are much richer and deeper Jewish and Christian and Islamic interpretations of that, right? But what I was exposed to was like, well, the religion is this. There's this, old man with a white beard in the sky, and that didn't connect with like the sort of cultural, humanistic, intellectual, scientific worldview that. And so it was like, well, we do this, but we don't really believe any of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So but I always had this sort of deeper spiritual longing. So it wasn't hard to walk away from the religious side of it, but the cultural side, and for a lot of Jews, those things are kind of blended and melded and intermingled, and it's hard to decipher. But the real transition that happened was actually when I got engaged. My wife and I took, because at the time it was very important to me that our children be Jewish for sort of these cultural legacy reasons. And when my wife and I were engaged, she's Korean American. She grew up in the church in a very religious context. And we took an Intro to Judaism course together. And it was the first time that I had revisited all of these things as an adult. And I basically walked away from that course feeling, it's going to sound like it was a bad class. It actually was a great class. But I walked away from it feeling, yeah, I'm very culturally Jewish, but like religiously and philosophically, I just don't connect here.
Yeah.
And so I was like, okay, time out. Don't convert, or at least certainly don't convert for my sake. And that's when I suddenly felt liberated to really pursue where my interests were. And that's when I started. Now I had done some dabbling in some meditation before and read a few books, so that started before, but that was when I suddenly felt like the shackles were taken off and I was able to really take a deep dive.
The shackles. Okay, so you felt like more so shackles in the sense of just cultural norms of like, okay, I need to be not perceived, but maintain these things for
Yeah.
cultural heritage, and if I do something different, then am I jeopardizing, or am I, not being a good, um I don't want to put words in your mouth, not being a, good Jewish person, or maintaining that legacy properly. Is that fair to
Yeah.
say?
Yeah, and also I
Okay.
think there's a difference between being like a Jew boo who's like, I'm Jewish, but I do some meditation, which I have a lot of people, and somebody like me who really does, I practice in a very specific Tibetan Buddhist lineage. That is my primary spiritual practice now, like
Yeah.
I have a shrine room in my house.
Yeah.
I have I think that level of depth would have been would have and it was problematic for my family. So I think to take that deep a dive is what I felt unshackled to
Yeah,
do.
you start bringing the statues in, it's like, "Whoa, man. Hey, chill
Exactly.
out."
It's like, yeah, go ahead,
Like
take a yoga class and learn how to
like
meditate. It's another
yeah,
when like when my mother sees me, doing prostrations or
yeah,
something
yeah,
like that, then that
yeah.
got
Especially,
much
well, the
more.
tantric path too is a whole 'nother level, I
Yeah.
think, with that, because then that's, like, way more, yeah, that's way more active. We'll get into that, but, okay, so then we're moving along, and then you're free to kind of explore, or you feel this freedom to, like, say, "Okay, my family is where I don't feel the pressure to maintain these certain types of traditions, even though there's certain cultural things that it's always going to be who you are. It's always going to be a part of who you are. I think, that's accepted. But now there's this freedom to explore. And now this was how many years into your acting career? This was how long had you been?
Mm, I would say now we're probably around like 2007, 2008. So just as my career is beginning to actually get some momentum. I mean, I graduated college in 2000 and I was in LA for a bunch of years and I really learned how to act there and I was in great classes, but I think only had one professional job. You know,
Hmm.
I was a struggling non-working actor
Yeah.
for all those years. So
Yeah.
it was when I got to New York. I mean, a lot of this happened at the same time. I met my wife, my career started to get some momentum, my spiritual life was shifting, it was all kind of sort of that quarter life transition happening at once.
Were you aware of what was unfolding? Like, meaning, did you feel the connection to the spiritual transition? Like, you're like, "Oh, I'm gonna open up to this," and then all the others start open, or did it did it feel like it was just kinda happening to you? I don't know if that question makes sense, but,
It kinda
um
does. It feels like those seeds were there, right? Like, I had taken an
mhm,
intro to world religions class in high school where we studied Buddhism, Hinduism, and Jainism. Thought it was fascinating. In college, I was an anthropology major, right? Which connects to acting and spiritual life, where in that it's anthropology, cultural anthropology, social anthropology is basically how do different people view the world, make sense of it, and interact with others. And to study that from within their own worldview, as opposed to the best of our ability, as opposed to
yeah,
studying that
yeah,
from our worldview.
yeah, it's very hard.
It's very hard, and I think that exercise is incredibly important, and it's
Yeah,
deeply connected to acting. And then
for
when I was
sure.
in LA and struggling, I was reading some books on Buddhism, and I was meditating a little bit, and so the seeds were there, and then it was like in that moment when I took that class and then it was like all of a sudden everything started to sprout.
Yeah.
So the seeds were there dormant and being gently watered for years and years and years. And then it really started to unfold, and quite quickly.
Was that a easy unfolding or was that a painful unfolding?
It
Like, do you
felt
remember
so
do you have
good.
felt easy?
I mean, it was hard, as I said, like some of the stuff with my family, but
Yeah.
it felt like aha, like
Okay, yeah,
it felt
yeah,
like a huge sigh of relief. Like, oh my
yeah,
gosh, this is what I've been like
yeah.
wrestling's the wrong word, but like uncomfortably trying to. It felt like I've been sitting in an uncomfortable chair for all these years. And then I finally found the chair that's like, oh, this is right. I don't know quite how to sit in it yet,
Hmm,
but every which way I do feels better already.
yeah. Well, it sounds like the discovery of the Dharma, really. I mean, like, discovery of where these paths like, just tuning into not just the paths that are out there, but what fits, like, what your path is and what you've been, kinda.
Yeah, I think for everybody, certain things just, it's like certain music that you hear and that's your jam, and other stuff you may like it, you may respect it, but it's not the one that you want to dance to, or
Yeah.
certain cuisines like oh, this is fantastic. Like you might prefer
Now
Italian, somebody else prefers French, but someone would be like, man, this is just I
yeah,
love it.
and it opens you up to start living like, there's a vibrancy, in my opinion, when you're living from that genuine feeling of, like, "This is what I truly enjoy, this is what I come alive in."
Yeah.
I know I've lived a lot of life in that phase and then out of that phase, and realizing, when I'm in someone else's sandbox and realizing, like, this is not the sandbox that I'm supposed to be playing in.
Hmm.
And, what I'm curious about, because I lived in LA as well, I was a dancer, and, I know that, with artists especially, I'm curious to hear if this was your experience, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but it almost feels like when we live from that place or when we connect with that, things in life begin to happen much much easier. So I'm curious to hear your side. Like, what was your experience was with acting? Like, how did your acting career change once those things started to come into alignment? Like, did you notice like what? Maybe it was just already a time, because there is a thing where people say it's like, the first 10 years, no matter what you're in, is going to be hard. And then
Hmm.
after this amount of time, it starts to open up. So there's that. But I also think that there's this reality of like, when you stop fighting the universe and start aligning, a lot of beautiful things will start to open up. I don't know if that was your experience or not, but
I think, yeah, I think you start to. I think whatever one's proper fit is, because I really am a pluralist at heart. Um, and we can get into that as well if we want. But what I mean by that is I definitely don't think there's one path for everybody. So the Buddhist path
yeah,
is the right one for me. That doesn't mean it's the right one for other people. But I do think
right.
when you're where you need to be, you start to develop a sense of arrival
Yeah.
where you've just arrived in your own life. Like sometimes being in your own body feels yeah, I don't know how else to explain it other than, like, you feel like now you are where you're supposed to be, whereas everything before was you're trying to adjust or tweak or correct. And I think as an artist, that arrival, that sense of acceptance, right? Like, maybe my career won't ever go anywhere, and that's okay. Maybe, it's like it's
Mm,
surrender,
yeah, yeah.
acceptance, and
Acceptance is a great word.
yeah, I think all of them, surrender, acceptance. I like
Yeah,
arrival.
yeah.
Um,
There's there's great work I really love, there's work by, I think he actually, is a professor at Harvard, Harvard Divinity, Charles Stang. He wrote a book called Our Divine Double, and,
huh,
it lines up with a lot of what James Hillman wrote in The Soul's Code, which is just about the daimon, about that inner inspiration, and interestingly enough, if you read The Soul's Code, I think you would really enjoy it because he actually talks about a lot of famous actors and a lot of celebrities, and he kind of highlights this point that we all come into the world with this in a sense this divine double that is not something we achieve through causality. It's like it's not like we build up through the ego to arrive at the divine double. It's ontologically more foundational. So it's like it exists in a way that kind of pulls us to it, and we experience life um, in this progression of like as things unfold, as we surrender, as we accept, as we kind of let go of all the things that we're not, we see more of the things that we are, and that feels that's it's like it has that feeling of I feel more like myself, which is a
uh-huh,
very interesting thing to say because it's like it feels more normative. It's like at a certain level, it's like this feels like who I've always was supposed to be,
yeah,
which is very interesting because now it takes out that whole equation of like what you were saying. It's like, oh, I've got to accomplish to become, which I think is the trap that many actors and people in the entertainment industry fall into, is it locks us into that performative
yeah,
becoming in which you will always be looking for the thing that will make you feel complete or make you feel successful or whatever it is.
right,
And at the end of the day, I think the only thing that anybody's ever going to have any peace is when they accept that which they are,
yeah,
and just kind of yield into that divine double that
I
they already
agree.
have.
And don't
And
get me wrong, I have not completed that process. You know what I mean? Like, being an
I don't
artist
think
in
it.
this I
Yeah, no, I
struggle
don't think
with
it.
this
Yeah.
still, but I've just
Well,
made progress.
no, and I mean, and yeah, and I think that's the beautiful point of it is that no matter where we're at, I think that there's always those levels of becoming more, and at every path, at every experience, every story, every encounter, you're just encountering these more things in yourself that you're letting go of, and then you're becoming, more in tune with that. To me, that divine double or that thing, and
It's called
that's
the
never
Soul
ending.
Code? I don't know it, so I wrote it down.
Well, James Hillman wrote a book called The Soul's Code. It was more of one of the more popular books of his. It got a lot of people in the depth psychology world. They kind of hate on it because it was kind of like a pop. It got big in pop culture, and as
Okay,
like anything in academic spaces, if it's big in pop culture, they
right,
tend to look down on
right.
it. uh, his other book, Revisioning Psychology, was probably one of his better books as far as like in that world goes. But Charles Stang also wrote The Divine Double, and Jung talked a lot about the self and the ego, like this. The process of individuation is kind of what we're talking about, and that is that process of becoming whole through all this stuff. So it sounds like a lot of what you're saying and what this process is. But okay, so what I'm interested in is this process of you know starting this practice. You started to participate in did you go to any classes, or when you
Yeah,
you, you had
so
these this
yeah,
sensibility of like, okay, I'm open to this now. Did you approach it scholastically? Were like, I'm just going to read about it a lot, or you're like, I'm just going to participate in it, or I'm going to like like
it
what was your step into
it's a
that?
great question. I think that I am, like, naturally where I feel most comfortable, at least initially, is scholastically. Like, I'm
Yeah.
interested in I think things have to, appeal to me, and and resonate intellectually, philosophically, you know, ontologically,
Yeah.
epistemologically. Like those are the areas where, and then I can be open to experience, faith, felt sensation. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And both are important, but my first doorway is through the head, and some people are the other.
Yeah.
But ironically, over time, the heart-centered stuff has become the most important, but it just takes me for like, the safety net is to, like, go through the investigative step.
You're a true
So for me
Westerner. You're a true Westerner. I mean,
yeah,
that's like the the plague of our society
it's also
right
very
now. But
Jewish, you know? It's like very
yeah,
it's
yeah,
like sort of the
yeah.
intellect and through study and analysis and
It's the
investigation.
logos. Yeah, it's very
Yeah.
much the logos.
So I did start reading, and if you had asked me from the outside, I would have thought that I would have ended up, like, in a Zen tradition, but
Mm,
I ended up being sort of gravitating over time to the Tibetan traditions, which is interesting to me because from the outset, they had some of the things that would have been the most off-putting, you know, like elaborate elaborate ritual and
yeah,
all kinds of things that especially when they didn't make sense to me, I was like, "Yeah, I'm not interested in that." But as I started to learn, I found myself being drawn more that way. And so then I started sitting some retreats. I started at the New York Shambhala Center. And that as an organization did end up having, you know, they've had some problems over the years. Um, but the classes that I took there and the teachers I met there were fantastic. And I had nothing but good things to say about my personal experience there. You know, the other stuff was more like on the national level. And so, you know, the more I would sit, the more I would want to read something, the more I would read, the more I would want to sit, the more I'd want to take a class or sit a weekend retreat. So it kind of like snowballed. And then I
yeah,
got to a phase where it was very clear to me that I wanted to start meeting teachers. You know, this was where we tie back to that conversation about Star Wars and Karate Kid that and because I'd been in that situation with acting, like it wasn't until I met like exceptional teachers that I feel like really were able to elevate my craft. It became clear to me that this at least for me was not something I only wanted to do intermittently on weekend retreats and through reading books, that I really wanted to meet like I wanted like apprenticeship, you
yeah,
know? People wanna learn to
yeah,
be a chef. Like I need to get in the kitchen and not just read cookbooks. I need to get in the kitchen with a chef who knows what they're doing, who can really teach me. And
yeah,
that's when I then started meeting, you know, authentic teachers and lineage holders, and so then that is how that kind of started to begin and spiral. But I just wanna throw in a quick so this we've now just told, like, the long version of this story,
yeah.
and the short version, which I'll say, is I grew up in a household filled with tantric Buddhist art. My
Hmm,
mother was a collector, and she collected all kinds of stuff, but one of the things that she had a specific collection of was Tibetan Buddhist tantric art, sculptures, like dharma protectors. You know, at the time, it was just a piece of art, but I actually think now in hindsight, that's the short version of the story. How did you become a Buddhist? Well, I grew up in a house full of tantric art.
yeah, yeah,
And, of course, I
yeah.
didn't recognize that until years later, but
Well, there's 2 ways of looking at that. I think that there's, like, the reductionist or materialist way of, like, "Oh, here was images that you saw that then, like, was implanted and then led to this." But then there's also this thing of, like, I wonder how much of your story, what was going on in your mom like, unconsciously, what was happening in, your mom's mind as she was acquiring this art for no real reason, just other than maybe an aesthetic or just a thing was like, "Oh, this is interesting." Um, but then I wonder, when we talk about dharma, we talk about these paths, and it's like how much of this stuff is kind of, we just come into as a bigger pattern. It's like overlaid as part of a thing that was, back to the divine double. That's a lot of the points that it was making. It's like so much of things are just laid out and we walk into them and we discover them. And it could have been like your mom was kind of doing the same thing. She
mhm.
was like walking into this unconsciously, just acquiring this stuff that would eventually, open you up to something.
I mean, I think it has
Um,
a lot to do with karma because
yeah,
it's not like we didn't have Jewish art also. It's just that, you know what I mean?
yeah,
It's not like being you know, I noticed that my wife has a real affinity for Islamic art. You know what I mean? Like the geometric
Mhm.
shapes. She's just always really captivated by it. She's not a Muslim, but I think sometimes people are, and I think it does have to do with people's karmic patterns. You know what I mean? Like
Mhm.
there are certain things that just kind of magnetize you through familiarity. And obviously, we could, as Buddhists, believe in past and future lives. I mean, believe is a loaded word, but if that's part of your worldview, something like this starts to make a lot more sense quite easily.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, totally. Totally. Well, so, okay, so I wanna move into The Chosen,
Yeah.
um, because, we've kind of walked into this path where you started practicing more Buddhist traditions. You're already, have Jewish sensibilities. You're looking into Christianity a little bit in proximity, I guess, because of, the show, or maybe you had started looking into it before. Um, but talk to me about what your experience was when you started that show,
Mm.
where you were at with how you were viewing these things, not just academically, but like, how you were viewing the communities, and then how did that transition when you started the show, or how has the show impacted it?
It's impacted me in huge ways, and I would say that if I'm being honest, growing up, there was always, growing up as a religious minority in the United States is it's an interesting experience. I mean, it mirrors in one way other minorities, right? Like there's something that always just feels it's like that conversation we had a second ago about anthropology. People who are part of whatever is normative
Mhm.
sometimes have a hard time seeing the water they swim in. It's so
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
it's just
totally.
it's what's normal and right. It's the way the world works. And so if you're never part of that, you're actually always highly conscious of it. So
Yep.
Christianity is, I mean, I remember dating a girl when I was like 10 and she not 10, that's way too young. That can't be right. She must have been 14 and I was 13. And by dating, I mean, she like wanted to invite me over. Like we liked each other. Maybe we held
Sure.
hands. She
Yeah, yeah,
invited me
yeah.
over to her parents for dinner and she was like, "Oh, but don't tell them you're Jewish," you know? And I was like, "Okay." But you have those kind of experience, not like anti-Semitism in some big grand way, but just this way that you're like, yeah, I'm not that thing. But
Yeah,
I always had this slight like something about this feels like unusual, like I don't belong.
right.
But I'd never really investigated Christianity seriously. I'd never really engaged. I'd never read the New Testament. Obviously, I knew who Jesus was, or it's all over the place, pop culture. But even the emphasis on like belief is so. From the way I grew up as a Jew, it's all about questioning and investigation, and that
Yeah,
it didn't seem to be a natural fit. You know what I mean? So I
yeah,
kind of just had never. I had tons of Christian friends, like all my roommates in college. It's not like I didn't interact with Christians, but it wasn't until the show that I really started to engage, that I'd read the New Testament, or to really start to investigate and study about Jesus and who he was, and to start to engage with like more thoughtful and I would say religious Christians, as opposed to people who were like, yeah, they go to church, but we never talked about theology or anything like that.
yeah,
And it's really, um, I would say through that and my Buddhist practice, it's really made me feel much closer and warmed me up to both I mean, the Judaism of my youth and Christianity. I feel like I have a much deeper understanding now of all the Abrahamic faiths,
yeah,
as well as the differences. You know what I mean? But I think I have a much deeper appreciation for them, and I have a lot more insight into the Christian world that I see. Although there are challenges for me talking about that and expressing it because to a lot of Christians, I'm like this person who is like investigating this stuff from the outside. And I sometimes come to different thoughts and conclusions. So I think of that in some ways as an asset, but I'm aware that, you have to be careful and respectful when you're engaging with somebody else's like deeply heartfelt tradition. And
It
but I haven't,
so
I don't have
yeah.
the doctrinal background, which to me is very
Well,
liberating,
yeah,
you
but it
know?
also it reminded me of there's memes that I've seen where it's it's like a person invites somebody to church, like, "Don't worry, church is chill," and then he gets there, and it's this guy yelling the stuff, and the guy's just like, like, "What?" And it's just it can become so colloquial sometimes too because you get into these things that people do, especially when you start talking about the propositions, because it's one thing to just have a ritual and be like, "Oh, this is just a
What are the
ritual,"
propositions?
just this idea, I don't know, it could be anything. Like if you go to a charismatic church and, God's gonna come down and do this today, and
Okay.
we're gonna, maybe the Southern Baptist style or whatever it might be, and or whatever that man says that day or his view is, and you go into that church and you have this kind of outsider perspective of like, what is he talking about? But if you're in it and you've just been around this pastor for so long, you're kind of like, yeah, he's just in it, man. Like this is what it is. Like you just believe, and there's all these like this is what happened to me. I was in the evangelical world, but I was never like really in it as far as like knowing the administrative or the pastoral roles or any of that. And I wound up working for a church, and I quickly realized, or working adjacent to a church is kind of confusing, but I quickly realized like amongst the church staff, there was like the Bible, but then there was like this hidden Bible that everybody had a hidden interpretation in which everybody had agreed upon. This is how this works. That's how this works. Not clearly stated in the text, but contextualized through tradition. And I kind of bumped up against that of not knowing the correct way to do church staff and being very much on the fringes of, so I can relate in that sense of uh these niche communities where you're around stuff and you're looking at it with that. I don't even know, sometimes for me it didn't feel investigative as much as it just felt like curious, as in the sense of, wait, like this doesn't really fit. Like, it just doesn't fit. Like, I don't know how this fits, It's like,
I
especially I think for artists, it might be especially hard because I think as an artist, you're always looking at these different perspectives in that way, or you're always just, having a curiosity about it. Where sometimes when you're in those religious modes, it's not so much about the curiosity or not so much about the questioning of it as much as it is just about, this is what this is, we've just kind of someone somewhere back in the day decided this was how it is, and that's just where we're at now.
yeah.
That happens a lot too.
I mean, I think, Trey, the thing that I found most basically, it's funny to me, like, I feel like I have one, very close friend who's she's an evangelical or an evangelical adjacent, and she's been very, charitable in terms of her time and energy and talking to me about this stuff, but it was also it was very eye-opening and informative and engaging, and I really appreciate the time and energy that she gave me talking about these things. But what's interesting to me that I find as this outsider looking in is I feel like I can affirm literally everything about Jesus except for exclusivism. That seems to
Mm,
always be the dividing line. And, so I've basically landed in a place that's very similar to what a lot of people who've gone through a deconstruction process have ended up, those who have stayed Christian, you know what I mean? Like some have left
yeah.
the faith, but some stay Christian just with a slightly different, interpretation. But like in having these conversations with her, it's like she would want to like look at a Bible passage, and I'm like, okay, so we would study it, and she's like, well, this clearly says this. I'm like, but it doesn't clearly say that, like at all. Clearly say that. And we would then go through it, and I'm like, okay. And it was just layer after layer after layer of interpretation that wasn't considered an interpretation.
Yeah.
And, you know, and even pointing out like there are 45,000 different Christian denominations, more than every other world religion combined. And they don't all agree. So how are we not saying, and several of them, not each one of them, but many of those thousands believe that they are not an interpretation and everything else is an interpretation. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? And so that to me was like a very interesting thing to engage with and navigate. And it just kept coming up again and again and again and again. And if I had to boil it down to anything, that's where I'm noticing now that it's that the question of exclusivism is the only, and I have issues with, like, my mother-in-law, she has a lot of problems with my Buddhist practice. And in the end, the only thing we basically disagree on is exclusivism.
Yeah. And I've had that conversation with other religious pastors and people that I feel very strongly to maintain that connection to and have dialogue with, because I do think that I think it's too simplistic to try to reject Christianity
Yeah.
outright. I think it's way too simplistic, and I think to try to, categorize it in ways that are, reductionist or materialistic. It inevitably, I think it doesn't I think it's just yeah, I don't think it leads anywhere that
Why
is,
would I don't personally, I don't get why we would do that with any faith, because then you can't learn anything from it.
100%. Yeah, and
And
yeah, and I get why it happens though, because of that sectarianism that you're talking about causes the connection with imperialism, colonization, that
yeah.
normative thing you were talking about, that creates a lot of trauma, and I think that there's a tendency to swing, if you come out of that world or if you've been marginalized or hurt by that world, it becomes a lot easier to try to it's not even a thing of choice sometimes. I mean, I've experienced in my own life, there's a natural recoil that starts to happen when you hear it, because you associate all of the things with that word, with all of the baggage and just the harmful rhetoric of like manipulation and all of that's been used. So um trying to unpackage all that and to talk about it in a way that is that doesn't do that is, I think, really important and really hard. And I think you offer an interesting perspective because you come kind of from the opposite side where you're like, I don't really have all that. But when I come into it and I see that, I can, I'm like, yeah, whoa, like, no thanks on that. Like, I don't need the exclusivity.
Well, I mean, it was really eye-opening for me after talking to all these Christians who would explain this to me, from their perspective, but then encountering countless my perspective is not my interpretation from outside Christianity. I mean, I basically discovered there are countless Christian theologians from the get-go who have taken this position. I mean, all the Christian mystics and all
Yeah.
these
Hmm.
contemporary people like Raymond Panikar and John Hick and Paul Knitter and Wilfred Cantwell Smith. I mean, all of these people have done really great and deep work that I find to be very compelling. I understand that there is dispute and debate within Christian circles. I'm sure that's good and healthy. And I, I mean, I even, from my perspective, see something like I have a bit of like a reconciliatory vision for even exclusivists, which is part of me feels like without trying to sound, it's very hard to talk about this properly without sounding like I'm trying to imply that I know anything better. Do you know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Yeah.
But sometimes I feel like, great, if you're an exclusivist, just keep going with that, keep going further, because you get to the point, I think, where you realize whatever you want to call that experience, either non-duality or unitive or indwelling, like these are different words, but functionally, I think people are basically talking about the same thing or something very similar. And when people have that experience, that connection to the divine, then they know that you can't put boundaries around the infinite.
Yeah.
And once you're
Yeah.
there, however you get there, and I'm not implying that I am there and that other people aren't. I'm trying to be very careful with how I talk about this. I hope you get the point.
Yeah, I
When
get you.
people have that, then even people who've been an exclusivist, and some of them I've spoken, they do admit that, yeah, it's a mystery beyond it's beyond my comprehension. So I don't know. And so,
Yeah.
it's like, I don't know that there's a lot of benefit. It's not like people, they argue about it. And I don't know what good that necessarily does. Um, I think my issue being somebody who is a religious minority and even, is that there's something that can happen that is often very asymmetrical in the conversations. Because if you walk into a conversation with somebody who inherently holds the view that Christianity is superior or like a triumphalist view, it's never really a full dialogue. You know what I mean? Like
No.
I'm saying to them, "Oh, I want to learn about your faith. I think it's 100% valid. It's not the right one for me.
Yeah.
And I've investigated what you say. It's still not the right one for me." But when they're having that conversation, no matter how kind and gentle and loving they are, from the position that, yeah, but really you're wrong
Mhm.
and you just don't see it yet. It's hard. And then it becomes hard to like even like engage, fully with them because sometimes at the
Yeah.
outset, they'll say something about Buddhism that is like not representative. It's like a straw man, they're like, well, the Buddha this. And it's like, well, that's what
Yeah,
Christians have thought for 200 years, but that's not what
yeah, I
Buddhism.
see that a lot. I see that a lot in my comment section where people will bring up stuff that I'm like, it's clearly, but people are indoctrinated in that way. I was indoctrinated. Like what ends up happening is when you when you center life on that propositional tyranny, like when you place propositions at the top, and then you take all of the insecurity, all of the uncertainty of what it means to be human, all the mystery that is not just mystery in the sense of like, oh, this is a fun mystery, but mystery in like the Kierkegaardian sense, like the despair, the terror, the unknowing, the cloud of unknowing that becomes not just a fun simple thing, but like a lot of psychological, like when you face that, you're faced with the depths of the pain of not knowing. And I think many people, instead of facing that, instead of going through that death and rebirth, center the ego into those propositions. And so it's like the mind becomes just completely capacitated. I mean, it's full to the point of that proposition. So there isn't a dialogos like you're talking about when you enter into somebody that has let go of that proposition and is just being instead of trying to have these beliefs. It's like you're like, I want to be a human with you in this space and just be. And they're like, well, I can't be because I have a certain way that I have to align myself to, otherwise this I am forced to face terrifying realities of uncertainty and mystery. Now, when you get through that, you end up realizing that like there's rebirth on the other side. It's great. Like it doesn't end up killing you. But before that, there's so much unknown that I think it just doesn't allow. So even if a person wanted to, I just think that fear and uncertainty of what that would mean, um, will not allow them to. Cause I mean, as you're saying that, I can think back to a time in my life where I moved forward saying, "Sweet, I found the answer."
Mhm.
So every relationship that I had, I began to then, like you said, filter it through that thing of like, well, my mission now is to share this answer with everybody that I meet, and everything is orchestrated around that. So if like something synchronistic happens or whatever, it's like, well, that's because God wanted them to, you know, do this thing or
Mhm.
whatever. But there would be these things that would happen that would like kind of shake up things in which it was never as clear. Like things would happen, but it would challenge me to where it would like push that past what I was capable of, or what I was being told to like hold it within this container of like traditional religion of like we've got the answers and we're right. And luckily for me, I think there was just too many mystical experiences that I personally experienced that just shattered that. And I think for a lot of people, like what you're saying, I think everybody has to eventually reach that place in which they take whatever that proposition is that's filling their brain to the complete maximum, and then they finally hit something that, like, puts them into that, cognitive dissonance of like, "Whoa, it doesn't work. It doesn't fit here."
Or it just gets so big and expansive, it's as if the balloon has popped. You know what I
Right.
mean? And then everything fits. And I think that perhaps that's the meeting point. You know what I mean?
Mm,
I
yeah.
wonder. I don't know. Um, it's not how I'm wired, but I just want to be clear. Like, I'm not. I hope that didn't come off as a criticism of Christianity. What is clear to me is that there's some interpretations that resonate very deeply and closely, and others that I find more challenging. And I think it's beautiful that Christianity has this wide spectrum within it, and it was mostly Christian theologians that I relied on as I learned about this and unpacked it. But
Yeah. No, I don't think you came across that way.
okay.
I mean, I think it's appropriate to name certain things that for what they are, and regardless of what name that they're claiming, because I think that's a big issue that Christianity is undergoing right now, is that, like, I don't know what Christianity means anymore.
Yeah,
I don't know what it means. Like, I don't even know when people ask me if I'm a Christian, I was like, "I don't know what you mean," to be honest with you. Like, I just don't. I'm not trying to dodge in a Petersonian way or, like, dodge the question or just become, this, like, vague, like like, word just manipulation of it, but I truly don't know what this means, because when you, like you said, when you go back and you read church fathers, you read Nissa, you read Kusa, you read Meister Eckhart, like, you look at these people, Origin, you see a radically different mode, way of thinking, way of being, way of participating in the divine reality that lines up so much with Vedanta. When you look at David Bentley Hart, I don't know if you've read any of his work, but he talks a lot about Vedanta and early church father, early theology. And if you posted his stuff or his stuff gets posted, most of the people that call themselves Christians today are just attacking it, And so it's like at this point, you're like, well, exactly what you said. You have 40,000 different variations of it to
well,
try to
and it's
label
not
it. It's
it's
very
not
hard.
just those people, Trey. From my perspective, it's like as I read the Gospels, the roots of what those people are articulating is there, from my perspective, in Jesus, in his example, in his miracles, in his teachings, in his words. That I think perhaps people meet. I wonder what you think about
Mm.
this. Sometimes I think people meet the version of Jesus they need. Meaning, which I think in some ways supports it's funny because we're going to come full circle. It almost supports the exclusivist argument, which is that for people who Jesus, it's as if some meet the humble carpenter and teacher, some meet like all powerful God, some combine them, some meet a mystical teacher, some meet a intellectual rabbi who can debate, some meet a you know
Yeah, I do have
I
some
don't know.
thoughts on that.
Please.
I have a few. So I, the way
I'm
I
wading
look
way
at
past my depth now.
Yeah. So the way I look at that is I think the traditional, the not traditional, sorry, the traditional for me, for my
Yeah,
tradition,
yeah.
uh, um, this idea of Christ as the penal substitution, the atonement for a wrathful, angry God, and Jesus was sent on a special mission, and he died because that was God's wrath, and it's not how I view it. I very much view Jesus as the as this eternal mirror, this um, very powerful shadow revealer. He came into this world as a light that reveals that within us.
Mm.
And when you look at what he was doing, you look at him hanging out with the tax collectors, the prostitutes, the fishermen, the people that were not in the institution, what that was really doing in a lot of ways was especially within Jewish time, it was highlighting all the things that you weren't supposed to do. That's if you're a Messiah or a religious teacher, like that's not the spaces that you're supposed to be in.
Mhm.
And so for Jewish, the rabbis, Sadducees, Pharisees, when they see that right off the bat, all of the stuff within them that's like the test and the projection of the evil on those people, the others, those are the bad people. It gets highlighted, it gets shown, the cruelty of the Roman soldiers, what the way they treated Jesus, that comes out, that gets shown. And the people that met Jesus with this openness, this heart of like, I'm nothing, but I'm here. And
Mhm.
they meet and they have this encounter. It's like he's offering everybody that mirror of what are you gonna see? Like when you look at Jesus, what are you looking at? And I think the mistake that people will make is, I think you're right. When we meet Jesus meets us where we're at, but he meets us with a mirror, and he doesn't. And the mistake is when we see that and we assume that's who Jesus is, and we say, okay, he's that, and we stop, and that's where it stops. Instead of realizing that as that shadow that we can now release, we can now allow that to die and then be rebirthed, in the same way Jesus, did that. We get stuck in those spaces and we get
Mhm.
stuck of seeing Jesus as our projection. And so I think a lot of these people that that they'll come into counter with, if they hold on to Jesus that way, in many ways, it is very much, when people like the way I view things now is if somebody comes at me very angry or, just debating or just like, that's not blah, blah, blah. I'm like, oh, thank you. You're showing me who you are. Like, there's no reason to debate it because it's like you're just projecting the stuff that you're holding on to in that relationship. Because even if you believe something, like, there's a difference between just being like, oh, I believe that versus being like driven by that. Does that make sense? Like when people are just so compelled where they're like back to what you were saying, it's like they can't have that conversation of like, this is what I believe, but I could be, I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. It's very much there's a passion behind it that I think is much deeper.
Mhm. Yeah. I think, I'll just say I really connect, like, with his Sermon on the Mount, and this and the also that whole, you probably know better than I do that section about, kind of judging by the fruits. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And I sometimes have this perspective. It goes back to what you were saying about, like, what the label even means anymore, which is I actually feel strongly that I sometimes feel sad that as a how do I articulate this? It goes back to the sectarianism. I feel sad that anybody has surrendered on one side or claimed on the other side ownership of Jesus, who he was, and the example he set. What I mean by that is
Mm.
I, as somebody who kind of believes in sort of the perennial tradition, the wisdom tradition, I think of Jesus as a perfect exemplar of that. And I would say
Mm-hmm.
that it's like you said, the only reason I wouldn't self-identify as a Christian is because that was not my path in, and it's not my main form of practice. But also it's because of the sort of the doctrine and ideology and the rhetoric of some of the people who have claimed that label. So I'm like, okay, you guys duke it out and figure it out. Call yourselves whatever you want. But I don't think I guess what I'm saying is the Jesus that I encounter when I read the New Testament, from my perspective, oftentimes the people who are the best followers, some are Christian, some are Muslim, some are Buddhist, and some are Jewish. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
And so I'm
Yeah.
like, and I don't feel, it's like I don't think that they sometimes talk to me as if like, well, we own him. We own him because he fits our doctrine. Well, he actually fits my doctrine too.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, and I don't
Yeah.
have to.
Yeah.
your doctrine's not normative for me.
Yeah.
So I don't,
Right.
I understand that you
Mm,
think this is what this means, but I think it's fair. And even within your tradition, there are people who think it means this, something closer to what I think it means.
yeah, I think that's crucial, and I'm a big believer that that is part of the apocalypse of not the end of times, left behind, all that stuff, but the unveiling of the the spiritual realities around us. And I think what you're getting at, and these fractions of all of these things, it's like in one way it's good because as things begin to continue to fraction, they lose that centralized power, and it becomes something that now we get to reimagine, and we have conversations like this. And I think that's really healthy because I 100%, the way I view it is, and this connects with Tantra. Maybe this can like lead us into that. We can hit on that for a bit because I I experienced a lot of unexplainable phenomena when I was
Mm,
working at a social uh, uh, outreach center.
mm,
And started working with disenfranchised people, started seeing very like these archetypal spiritual symbolic eruptions where people would have these manifestations that were in many ways people were they would begin speaking in different voices, they'd begin saying things they couldn't have known, like unexplainable stuff. I mean, it was like and I study this, and so it's like uh, I've had Rob Falconer on the show. He talks about unattached burdens, and essentially, it's a thing that we've categorized in different spiritual traditions, some better than others, but it revolves around this idea of like the non buffered self, this porous self that we contain a lot of different types of energies and forces within us. And when we see this stuff that maybe churches called one thing uh, start to happen, for me, it really caused me to look at all of it differently.
mm.
Like the miracles of Christ, the demonic, like the exorcism stuff, like what was going on. Because Jesus wasn't the only one doing that stuff. I mean, the Jewish tradition has tons of people that, I mean, they have like a legacy of people that were doing this stuff. And so
And
to
if you
me,
brought
I
it
got really,
further, like the wider world, there was a lot more too.
oh, 100%.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, that's, yes. But, so for me, it was like, okay, so Christ, so it's like I began to understand that Christ is just this like a very powerful, like a very powerful archetype that doesn't mean he's fake or just an archetype. When I use that word, it's like there's a power there that is beyond and transcendent of how you and I are relating it or
Mhm.
how you and I are understanding it. And it transcends. And like that's kind of what you're saying. It's like it transcends beyond our definitions of it. And having that relationship with that that archetype and that figure and that logos for me is not something that is just propositional. Like I've seen that power and I've seen that like in a way that I'm like, even if I wanted to deny that, I'm not really being true to my experience.
Mm,
And so once I finally accepted that, even though I stopped believing in a lot of the dogma, realizing that if I'm being honest with myself, that relationship has already formed me, and I've already seen it move in people's life in a really powerful way.
mhm.
That I began to realize I'm like, I can't disconnect myself from the relationship with Christ. Like whatever in your imagination that is, I can't, you know, disconnect. But what was
And there's no reason
interesting
to.
is
There's no reason to. I
right.
mean,
Well,
you're
and
free to if you
yeah,
need to, but there's no reason
yeah,
to. Like,
yeah. Well, and some people, I think, coming out of the religious trauma, you feel you don't know what to hold and what to let go. Like it becomes really hard because you start associating all of those things together. And so then you're trying to get rid of the painful like
mhm,
the toxic damaging harmful stuff, and that it's it just kind of gets put in there.
mm,
And because of what you're saying is that you're
mhm,
constantly bombarded with people around you saying, well, you can't just believe in it however you want to believe in it, you have to adopt all of these other things depending on what their tradition is. And so then that becomes this hard line too, where people don't have the inner fortitude to, just say, no, I reject that. Like I will hold on to it the way that I want to.
well, and I think
That
that
becomes really challenging for people.
Yeah, I can imagine, and I'm sorry to hear that because I'm sure that is very tough, and I can imagine how hard that is to, like, disentangle, you know? But I think kudos to you or bravo for even trying, because I do think there is something very, there is a baby in that bathwater, you know what I mean? And I also think that people it I think that to maintain mm, it's like an artist, right? Like, if you just scribble on paper, it's not a piece of art. Just because Picasso breaks all the rules doesn't mean he doesn't know the history of art and the structure of how they got so that the things that he changes and shifts are still part of the same thread, the same continuum. And
Yeah.
I think that I don't it doesn't sound like either of us is I'm not advocating that people find their own individual like there is value to studying even the traditional and the orthodox, even if you then also study the mystics and you see where they're in conflict. And now you have the language and the sophistication to talk from within the dialogue of the tradition itself to come to the landing place that works. Do you know what I mean?
Totally.
So
Mhm.
that
Oh,
because the spectrum
100%.
is
Yeah.
so vast that you really you can navigate from within its own internal language, grammar, and get to the place that feels like the core, and that may be slightly different for different people. But I think I don't know. I just think it's important to do it that way because then you're not just like rejecting all these people who care about you and are worried about you. You can actually engage them. Like, yeah, well, I know that you think this passage means this. I mean, I have a great example. You want to talk about a concrete one?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So you know the passage, I think it's Matthew 11:25 through 30. That's mm, do you have an easy way to bring it up?
Yeah, I'll put it up on the screen too,
Okay.
but,
Well, this is an example of what I think is so interesting about this, right? Like some people in my experience who are exclusivists will talk about this as like a really concrete example of Jesus is like basically saying, I'm the way. It's not that line from John, but it's
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah.
but and so what's interesting to me, like having spoken to evangelicals about this, so much of the New Testament, right? You probably know this better than I do, refers back to other elements in the Old Testament, right? So Trey, do you know what the from my studies, and I'm no expert, but from what I've learned, what are the most important things that this passage references?
Enlighten me. I can't recall
Well, this is what was
the,
so interesting to me, just as an outsider. This is just an example, right? So, what this passage really references that I learned is the wisdom of Solomon, not the Song of Solomon, the wisdom of Solomon, which is a text that's part of the Catholic version of the Bible, but is excluded from the Protestant version. It's considered Apocrypha. But most scholars, even Protestant scholars, acknowledge that this is the most important thing you need to understand this passage. So my point of like, it's like by engaging from within the tradition, you can, or I have been able to like, it's it's wonderful to see like the different elements of the discussion and the unpacking. Like it provides a lot more color on these kinds of things.
Mhm.
Like, but that was just so fascinating and eye opening to me. And so like I have this evangelical friend who this for her this passage was a little bit tied to exclusivism, maybe not the most, but that's part of our discussion. But when you read the wisdom of Solomon and Sirach, these other things that it refers to, those are like some of the most pluralistic interpretations. And you see what I'm saying? So it's like depending what
Yeah.
aspect you're going to talk about or emphasize, and this ties to exactly what we're saying about, you know, I think sometimes the solution is just to take a deeper dive, you know,
Yeah.
not into the
Yeah.
part that's harmful, into the wider, richer tradition. That's my 2 cents from them.
Well, and it's very challenging, and I think what I notice is that I think that there is this idea that lives within the within the collective of or the church, the um, evangelical collective of the ability with what Luther was saying, the ability to read the Bible. It's like, oh, I'm going to just read the Bible, just follow the text. Um, anybody that studied sociology, anthropology, cultural traditions, philosophy, psychology, any of those, you realize really quickly it's like to try to sit down and just read an ancient text, like,
Oh,
like I don't care who you are or where you are, like that idea right off the bat, you have to go into it with
oh
a
my gosh.
with a negotiation of like, I mean, a humility. I laugh, and I don't mean this in like like I'm not laughing at them. I just the situation because I was in it. I was there. I'll see young Christians at coffee shops or whatever, and they're reading through Leviticus, and there's like God, and it's so funny because you're like, what in the world are they possibly getting out of Leviticus? Like, not that they shouldn't be reading it, but like just that the idea
Yeah.
of like, "Oh, it's so easy to do."
Ha-
But, like,
ha-
what other text? Like, you're not gonna pick up the Phaedrus and be like, "Yeah, like, we're just gonna look at Plato," and you're gonna be like, "I don't know what this is about," or
Have you
even, like,
heard
recent
James
texts, I mean,
Talarico's line about this? You know who James Talarico is?
I love Talarico, but I haven't heard his what he
So
says.
he basically said what he said on some podcast or somewhere. I mean, so I'm crediting him because I thought it was brilliant. But it speaks exactly what you're talking about. He said, imagine 3,000 years from now or 2,000 years from now, somebody trying to understand the difference between a butt dial and a booty call, and how easily those could be translated as the exact same thing, but have wildly different meanings.
Yeah,
And unless you're going to do the homework, you you know what I mean? Like, and there's a lot of, I mean, you talked about all of those ways of deconstructing, but also just translation. Translation in and of itself is a you know, and that cracked me up, and I thought it was hilarious and brilliant at the same time. Like, booty.
100%. Oh, I mean, and, like and so I'm very careful with a lot of it too because I think, for me, I'm my degree's in transpersonal psychology, and my background is in Christianity, so it just ties, like, I'm always going to
Yeah,
like, I finally accepted that, like, that's not something that I will ever be able to completely detach myself from, nor do I want to, and and I hold it with the sense of, like, at the end of the day, the phenomenological experience of what of the lens in which we see and participate and how we are showing up, going back to this idea of Christ and w- what the negotiation with Christ is via these texts. Um, I think without a base understanding of how, like a base of the psyche, really, of like how we are of consciousness, and like
yeah.
how we are perceiving reality around us, if we don't start with that and we try to jump into the text or we try to jump into propositions or we try to jump into something that is like metaphysical, like like we build around these, like it's like we're constructing castles in the sky. I mean, you're really trying to look at something that more often than not, you're going to just be wrong on, even if you're, have well intentions of looking at something with a genuine, with like, just being like, I really feel like, God really told me. It's like I don't want to discredit that, but like, when I was in high school, God told me a lot of things that ended up being very different than how they were, and so I think holding that is, it's I think it's step 1, and, like, trying to ground this back, and a lot of the stuff that I try to pull out of within this, like, when I look at scripture is very Jungian, like, I won't deny that, like, I think I have a very Jungian lens in which
Mhm.
I view scripture, um, and understanding that a lot of what he's saying, if you look at it through the lens of, even if in the verse, you weren't talking about this verse, but the other verse that so many people will quote of, I'm the way, the truth, and the light. No one gets to the Father except through the Son. It's like, well, you have to ask yourself some questions, like, who is the I? Like, in that verse,
And
like,
who is
who
the
is the
Father?
I? And who's the Father? And who's the Son? Like, what is the Son? Like, I think we just read that and we just kind of on like the surface level, we're just like, oh, I got this. The Son was the historical Jesus, and the Father is the God in the sky, and I'm the one he's saying it. So it's like you categorically place them, but then you start realizing you're like, well, wait, was Jesus telling them to believe in him to get to the Father? Why would he be telling to believe? He already is there. Like, of course they believe. Like, they're looking at him. Like, they're in the
Well,
room with him. Like,
have you heard?
how could it be the same relationship that we're having to him?
Yeah. Are you familiar with some of Paul Nitter's work? I think on that exact. Um,
No, I haven't looked at it. You said Paul
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 Nitter
Neuter?
is somebody who I found very interesting because he's a dual belonger. He was a Catholic priest
Okay.
and he's a Buddhist practitioner, and he
Oh,
identifies
cool.
now as both.
I love that.
So his insights are really interesting to me. But he talks about that passage as a lot like, he's like, it's devotional language expressed in a private setting with his disciples. He's like, it's like me telling you that my wife is the most beautiful woman in the world. That is true. It also doesn't imply that she's literally the most beautiful woman in the world compared to every other woman. It's that, but that's how you talk about those kinds of deep, connected devotional relationships. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
and I just think it's a really sophisticated and brilliant way of talking about passages like that. Uh,
Yeah.
Top of all of the unpacking that needs to happen about some of those terms.
Well, and even if you don't even and that's what I always look at with these verses that I think and it highlights your point as well, because I think this is I think it's more in the Jewish framework is like they already do this kind of better. Um, Even if you don't have all of those tools or that kind of awareness, even if you just keep reading the verse, like the scripture in itself, like if you sit with it long enough, will show you things that make the 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 first translation or the first takeaway maybe not the right one. Like, because even when with that verse, it's like, what Philip I think asked him was like, where is God? And he's like, are you not listening? Like, if you've seen me, you've seen God. Like, he says it really clear, like, I and the Father are one. So it's like this idea of you start off by thinking I got to get to God through Jesus, but then Jesus says, you're not getting anywhere. God's right here. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. So he's got to be talking about something different. Even within that verse, he's telling you right there that this is not about a roadmap. I'm not giving you directions to get to a place. I'm talking to you right now in this moment, right in front of your face. And, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. What does that mean? Okay, well, here's an individuated connection through the life of Christ, through the sonship, like through that representation of what it means to actually embody a connection to God in the now, right here, right? So
And
it's funny to me because all these verses will offer you ways out where they're like telling you very clearly.
I don't know what your time situation is on this podcast, but like that is in many ways a great segue to Tantra, I think. But I don't know if I don't
Yeah,
know
for
what.
sure. Let's hit on that. I mean, we'll if you're good for another 20 minutes or
Yeah,
so,
I
15,
am.
20
I am.
minutes, and then okay,
I
cool.
allotted until 3 just in case. So, but I don't.
Okay, perfect,
But
perfect.
you're in charge here. So whenever you need to.
No, I think so. For me, like I'll share my introduction,
Yeah.
with this and how I got into tantra, and then I would love to kind of segue this in because uh you know for me, I had no idea about what tantra was. I had never studied it. I had never really looked into Hinduism. It was something that was like, oh, this is too much. I don't know where to even start because it's been one of those things where it's like scholastically you read it, but like they do a really good job of like keeping that all kind of tangled up to where it, it's very different than the Western mind as to how they, approach stuff. Very much like Zen. Zen's the same way. It's like when you really read Zen practitioners, it's like it's hard to like learn Zen through a book. So I just stayed away. but
Mhm.
I do dream work and I pay attention to my dreams. And I had a really powerful dream about Shiva before I knew who Shiva was, what Shiva was. Had two dreams that involved Shiva, uh, in which I encountered Shiva and like was devoured by Shiva and came out the other side. It was a really powerful dream that I woke up thinking like, what just happened? And that led me into all these other synchronicities in which I started to really become opened up to Tantra and what it was. And the more I got opened up, the more I realized that a lot of the like deliverance stuff that I had done, a lot of the high impact, like this the name of Christ, like the way that I was viewing that and approaching that seemed very similar to how a lot of tantric teachers will talk about the relationship with the deity, the sadhanas, the way that they would approach, the gurus and how that they would, bring this in to focus. And then the psychological lens adds a whole nother layer. But long story short, for me, it all kind of came together in a really robust way of realizing that, like, oh, these things really actually fit together a lot more than I realized that they do.
These things meaning Tantra and
The
Christianity?
Yes, Tantra and Christianity, I would say the more dramatic synchronicities of the like my Christian faith of like what I was seeing, I mean, I think there's the cities and you have all of those things in the Eastern tradition that they talk about some. Um, but yeah, that kind of hands-on grappling with reality and spirituality and those in the collab not, I won't say collaboration, but it's like uh the impact of that, like that if that makes sense.
It does. How did you navigate, or you must have had Christian colleagues and friends when that was first happening, who were like, well, isn't that like the exact moment that sometimes from within your tradition of upbringing that people are like, oh, well, that's demonic possession, or you're like, how did that experience open you up rather than like freak you out and freak the people out around you? Do you know what I mean? I mean,
Mhm.
I'm curious because
Well,
that's like I think that's a pretty bold, right? You know what I mean? Like a lot of
yeah.
Christians who would have a dream about being devoured by, uh, you know,
Yeah.
something that looks like a deity would be like, okay, this is the exact thing that's the problem.
Right. Well, and I think for me, yeah, well, I'd already left a long time ago and I, was as in school, grad school, and have already started the
You were
transpersonal
past the,
psychology, past all that. Now,
yeah.
that being said, it's still something that I haven't shared much, although I'm sharing it online.
Well, you
Um,
just did now.
so I've talked about it, and I had a dream recently that said a figure showed up and said, "Tell the truth," and so that's been a really powerful thing in my psyche right now. Of like yeah, like, and there's certain things that I don't that I won't share, not because of that, but just because I just think that I don't want to put that in the imagination of somebody, in certain ways, and so I'll keep certain facts to myself on it. But for the most part, what you're saying, no, I was already past it. I mean, it was to the point now where, I mean, but even still, when I started practicing, so
Mm.
once that happened, I was like, okay, I feel invited into this. I feel like this thing is calling me to be invited. But I like going back to what you were saying earlier, the guru tradition or the mentoree or like the mentor mentee
Mm.
relationship and a deep respect for Hinduism and Eastern practices of I've seen too many people appropriate cultures or jump into something and just say, "Oh, I'm going to start doing this" or whatever. Um, and not wanting to do that was has always been part of my ethos, and probably because of my the psychology background. Um, but when you have these experiences and when you have these dreams, you don't feel like you're choosing them. You feel like they're choosing you, especially when the synchronicities start to happen around it. And
Yeah.
I just felt very natural to say, "Hey, like this might be uncomfortable to so many people, but I know it's so real within me that it's like I can't not do it. I can't not, so I started doing some mantras and I started doing a practice where I was like doing a lot more overtly tantric type rituals and oddly enough, there was still a part of me that was like, oh man, I don't know. Like, very strange. Like, I'm like, where did that come from? Like, why? Like, why am I still? But it just shows how deep it runs when you're trained to, like you said, view this stuff as demonic or bad or whatever. Uh, you just don't realize how deep it runs until you start participating and really get into the weeds on it.
You know what that made me think of is, mm, so as an outsider, right? As an outsider to Christianity, when I read the Gospels, it feels, sorry, not just an outsider, but somebody who actually encountered Buddhist and Hindu philosophy at depth before Christian philosophical understanding and reasoning, right? So even though you can try to set something aside, you can't unsee the things that you have seen. You know what I mean? And both of
Mhm.
those traditions far predate the Christian tradition.
Yeah.
I mean, particularly Hinduism, thousands of years, Buddhism about
Yep.
600. You know what I mean?
Yep.
And closer to 1,000 before Christianity is more fully developed. So when I read that stuff, to me, Jesus felt very familiar, right? He reads like, and this is not my
Mm,
attempt at all. Please, I'm not trying to diminish or dim the exceptional or unique quality of Jesus or his divinity, even. I'm not trying to do that.
yeah.
But
Yeah.
he reads eh, like an Eastern guru. Now,
Hmm.
I'm not implying I've looked into the academic stuff on this. I know that I'm not one of those people who's pretending that Jesus' lost years were spent in India or anything like that. But maybe that is the case. There's never been any evidence, like
Yeah,
substantial
I
evidence.
appreciate you saying that. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah,
I'm not trying to like stir up like conspiracy
yeah,
and controversy that, there's no evidence to support that. But there is evidence that, these cultures were, there were Buddhist missionaries as far as Alexandria. That there
yeah,
were Jewish traders as far as India. I mean, ideas and intellectuals were communicating all kinds of thoughts and ideas. So, it's not beyond the pale to think that all of this was swirling in the milieu in which Jesus arose, number one. But, and this ties into something that I think is really interesting, which is that I think that this tradition is, I don't know if it still is, but I think it was there within Christianity. This is my own like theory a little bit, which is that as a Buddhist, it's actually made me closer even to my Jewish faith, right? Like now I understand some of these things, like take Kabbalah, for example.
hmm,
This tradition of Jewish mysticism, unless you're Hasidic, has basically become inaccessible. It still exists, but it's hard to really access it in a concrete way. And
yeah,
part of that is because a lot of that tradition was broken, right? Like during the Holocaust,
hmm,
a lot of these living wisdom masters were killed. And so a lot of the
yeah,
tradition was broken. It's still, it still exists, but in hard to access ways. And
hmm,
with all of the persecution that happened towards Christians, the terrible persecution that happened towards Christians at its outset, I think that something probably similar happened, that some of those threads of the kind of like the living master to disciple tradition, maybe they still
yeah,
exist in places, but maybe they got broken or damaged or misinterpreted or misunderstood. And maybe they still are accessible in areas that I haven't experienced it. But I do know that in some of the Eastern traditions, those are more still intact. And so by like
yeah,
having that experience in this thing, it made it much clearer to me about the Jewish thing, and also from my perspective, at least, the Christian thing as well. Even though I know that's
yeah.
my area of expertise, and I'm not trying to pretend that it is. I hope that made some sense. I don't know.
No, I immediately I'm thinking of Gnosis a lot, and I think about this idea of Gnosticism, and I know that gets like the problem with Gnosticism is when you look at the lens of like when you look at those texts through like a cosmological lens of like, oh, well, here's the overarching the demiurge and all of that information. I think it can and distract people in multiple ways where I think it can put too much emphasis put on the uh the the truth claims of like, well, is this true or was this not true? Like these different texts. And that will distract people from realizing that what did we actually have within the birth of Christianity? We didn't really have Christianity. Like we say it's confusing now. It was also confusing then. It wasn't like there
Yep.
was this one coherent, like you didn't have doctrine, you didn't have creeds, you had practices, you had people participating in rituals and shared meals and community, and you had basic like initiation type
Yeah.
uh uh, things that was not just like here's the Gnostics over here. It's like no, you had different type of the Sethians, the Valentinians, the Martian, like the Marcionites. Like, you had all of these groups that had maybe some ideas that were wrong, some ideas that were right. You know, it wasn't so much like oh I'm a prescriber, I'm a Gnostic. It was like well maybe I have Gnostic tendencies or something like that, and
Well,
then to whatever level. And so I think so back to what you were saying that lineage, like that type of information, same with I mean, personally, I don't know enough to the same degree I know this, but like what I sense when I hear people like when the Hindu tradition talking, Tantra has kind of a similar taboo in certain circles because it does have this like serpentine, Kundalini type, this higher awakening type experience that I think is unsettling across any tradition. And I think when you look throughout history, practices like that that are deeply entrenched in those
because they're boundary breaking.
yes, yes,
Yeah,
and
that's why I
they're
cut you
not
off because
something
you were
you
going towards
no, but
their
100 yeah,
yeah.
100%. Well, and they live in a way that's, like, harder to
But they do exactly what Jesus did. They are the
uh,
practices that break the boundaries of like, I'm gonna eat with prostitutes and tax collectors.
yeah, 100%, and I like Elaine Pagel's work on this.
Mhm.
She talks a lot about when the early church. I think a lot of people uh paint the orthodoxy in this way of like this big conspiracy of just evildoers, and same with what you were saying at the beginning with the Jewish people. It's like I think it's much more likely that they just didn't want to die in a lot of ways. They're getting persecuted, they're getting killed. It's like, hey, if we organize and we can get something that is just coherent that people can sign up for and believe, and we know how to like organize this, it functions a lot
I
easier.
think
Um,
sorry.
but but to that point, I think everybody's got their Constantine has his agenda, the church has their agenda, like everybody's trying to do a thing. But in all of that, what ends up happening, in my opinion, is that these radical forms of gnosis, these Kundalini awakenings, these tantric um, practices do not necessarily help in the administrative, collaborative ways of building organizational power dynamics.
No.
And when and that's where it gets, so from day one, not day one, I mean 300, 400, by then it was like, hey, we've got this pretty much wrapped up. Like we know how to. And then you had church fathers and mystics kind of slipping through and figuring out ways of communicating these, and then Origins kicked out of the church. So it's like there's always this debate that you find throughout the
Yeah.
entire legacy of that tradition, of this battle that we're talking about with maintaining what Jesus, like the gnosis that Jesus was actually, that was, I would say was actually, was potentially showing us in that manner.
Yeah, and I think that it's important to differentiate. You talked about this at the beginning, kind of like big G Gnosticism, which is like sort of the formalized cosmological
Yes,
view, and I would say like lower G Gnosis, which
yes,
and some of those texts, like the Gospel of Thomas, kind of they don't contribute at all to the big G Gnosticism. You know what I mean? And even the Gospels themselves, you probably know this better than I do. There's some passage where he talks about like, well, this is what we explain in the parables to the masses, but I
I teach you these teachings. Yeah, 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 in
right,
private, which is Yeah.
But I also want
Yeah.
to just differentiate that it, from a tantric perspective, and we're just speculating here, like we don't know. It's not about, sometimes people think it's like that there's something secret in the practice itself. It's like, I'm going to teach you a secret practice. It's practice that facilitate an experience, right? It's about the experience, not the practice. It's like doing an acting exercise, right? It's not about the exercise. It's about what that provokes in the artist in terms of what they then experience and therefore then understand. And I think that is, I suspect, is what the gnosis that's being referred to is. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
it's like a chef, right? The experience is the taste of the perfect soup. The technique of how they sous vide this or chop that or soak that is just the means to the end, but it's not actually what's being transmitted. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I also think that,
Hmm.
oh, I forgot what I was going to say. There was one other thing, and now oh well, maybe it'll come back to me.
Yeah. Well, so what is so from your perspective with this, so it's like, for me, I think of, the this the secretiveness is not so much in the sense of,
Oh,
did you remember what you were gonna
I
say?
did, and it's related to what you said about secretive.
Oh, yeah, I look at it as like, and from a depth, I'm a depth psychologist, and so when I think about working with clients and I think about, how the unconscious and the psyche works, it's like there are certain things that if a person, like a numinous quality of the unconscious, that if encountered in certain ways, uh will be destructive to to the ego, to the conscious mind. I mean, to the overall psyche. It can send people into these psychological states of distress. And so when I look at tantra and I hear these rituals and I hear these safeguards and I hear these types of protocols, I don't so much see them as like, here's the secret code as to like how to get to, this hidden god that is put, is somewhere that you have to, unlock the code to get to. I see that more as, here's things that have been tested and ways of engaging that are safer in the sense of more attuned to where the person's at on their journey and able to actually hold these types of this type of awareness. Because I do believe that if a lot of people have the spontaneous kundalini or whatever, um, or they hear something, it can become psychologically
Yeah,
destabilizing.
yeah. I think that what you're pointing at is, in our tradition, we talk a lot about certain things being self-secret, meaning you can go to Amazon and buy certain tantric texts and certain meditation manuals and things that are sort of quote unquote revealing some of the highest teachings. It doesn't mean, number one, that they're going to necessarily make sense or that they will connect or resonate. And so I think there's a lot of misconception around secretive, and I think it really is a protection. What it is, from my
Mhm.
experience, is like, here's a good modern day corollary. Look at the sort of psychedelic renaissance that's happening, right? Incredibly powerful, incredibly useful medications helping people in profound ways. Does that mean that you want your teenager to drop a ton of LSD and drive to a rave? That could be a disaster. But it
Yeah.
doesn't mean that in the right context, with the right set and setting, that it couldn't, cure them of alcoholism. I mean, that's what some of these studies are showing, and that's what was happening in the 1950s. And then it kind of got out in an uncontrolled way. So it's not always about, or here's an even simpler one. Like, think about martial arts. If I just read in a manual about how to break a brick with my forehead, I'm going to knock myself out and concuss myself. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean? It's not that that
Yeah.
isn't possible through proper training and step by step and practice, and that honing of intention and energy and focus. Wow, how powerful, how amazing. I think that's so cool when I see people do that. But sometimes people don't have enough like self knowledge to know like, well, that's not where I am. I'm not ready to break 10 bricks with my forehead. And they just totally wreck themselves. And it's not that Tantra is scary or even that it's dangerous. Like taking a martial arts class is not dangerous. You just have to learn with a proper teacher step by step in the way that is appropriate for you and where you are. It's not,
Yeah.
I think sometimes we make these things like so highfalutin, but it's actually really concrete. And we have this all the time with like kids. We watch certain movies with kids because other movies they're not going to understand yet. And it might just be scary. And it's not, doesn't mean that they won't love that someday, but first you start with Moana and Beauty and the Beast or whatever. And then, I'm not trying to infantilize anybody, but I'm just saying, even myself, like there are certain practices there are certain things that like practices that, for example, I've had an empowerment for. Well, I'm not ready to practice them. I'm not afraid of them, but I'm just aware that like, yeah, I'm not skilled enough yet in these other things to be able to do it. And, you know, anyway, that's sort of
Yeah, I think that's a
my take on that.
no, I think that's a great way of putting it, because I do think that there is a tendency to get lost in the metaphysics of anything, or the mystique of something. I've noticed when I listen to certain, and I don't. That's why I think I stayed away from a lot of the Hindu stuff for a while, because going back to what you're saying about LA and this idea of charlatans, it does, for me, it gets really challenging to navigate a space that I don't know particularly well, because it's like I don't know the nuances of what gets said and how it gets said and all this stuff, and that becomes challenging when you start looking at like experiential models, because you're like, okay, well, I'm gonna follow this teacher, like based on what, based on how well they know this, they can talk about something, or based on this or whatever. And so I find that to be interesting, because I have noticed that sometimes with certain teachers that I've listened to, there can very quickly become this thing of like, well, you better, if unless you do this thing, you don't need to like here's what you have to have, and the person that can give it to you is me, or the person that like here's like there's like that secretiveness becomes a way of kind of building up the clout of the person, where it's like oh well, and I think that's where people can get really I get the veneration or the admiration or following a guru. I don't have any problems with following a guru, but I think there's the worship of the person, or that feeling bound to that person, or that feeding of that ego that can cause problems, which I think was what happened in the West, with not necessarily with Tantra, but if you get certain teachers that come over, then you get these cult like personalities, and people begin to, look at it as like, well, it's an exotic thing that I don't know about. So I'm learning from this person. And so I think there's dangers on both
I mean,
sides there
I think a great
of,
rule of thumb is that all the great teachers, and I would say Jesus himself, they were always going, you think it's about me, right? And the ones who reinforce that are the ones to be careful of. The ones who take that and say, no, whatever you're seeing here is available there. You have it. I'm trying to ignite that flame that you see in me in you. Those are the good teachers, not the ones who are
yeah.
saying like, yeah, you need to do this for me or do this for me. That's like the complete inversion of.
Oh, 100%. Well, I'll say this too, and this is something, even a specific example, that this is just kind of a funny example. I heard two tantric teachers talking about the Namah Shivaya mantra, and one of them was like, "Do not say Om before it. That's not part of the practice." And the other one's like, "Om, you totally can say Om before it." And I just thought it was so bizarre, because I'm like,
You're like, which is
how
it?
does which is it? And like, also, like, how could it be? I'm like trying to understand how there's a danger of like, I'm like, what in what world are we adding and now we've added this dangerous factor to it? And the guy's like, and also don't do it inside, because this is dangerous to do inside. So it's like all these little nuances of like okay, is this a personality? But that happens within churches. People will be like, well, God's not gonna, make sure you don't, like, they get into these little fine details of certain things that become like, oh, that's really and like I said, with Christianity, it's much easier to discern, like, oh, this is just, I've read all the text myself. I know with the Vedic tradition, I'm like, I don't know as much. So, but I know like my basic intuition,
Yep.
and then I sit with it and I'm like,
I think
I wonder where that comes from.
people need to trust their intuition. If something doesn't feel right, be careful. I think that you know, I think that that's an always important thing to hang on to. I mean, I don't know a lot about that tradition, so I don't want to comment. But
Yeah,
the thing I wanted to say, and maybe this is a good place. I don't, if we're wrapping up, like
sure.
it ties up well, I think, because it goes back to acting, which is the thing about tantra, from my perspective, is that it's like it really is the reason that to it's not capturable in a mainstream way, because what it's doing is breaking intentionally mainstream boundaries, right? It blurs the line between things like sacred and profane, good and evil. What I mean by that, by blurring the line, is it doesn't blur one's ability to differentiate, but it's letting you know how contingent those things are. I mean, just look at Donald Trump, right? Some people think he's the gonna save the whole world, and some people think he's like evil incarnate. Well, which is it? Do you see what I'm saying? So like you
Yeah.
see that that's not really a fixed reality. And Tantra helps sort of unpack that, but that's destabilizing, not to the personality. It's actually very helps one grow up, but it's destabilizing to like power,
Ego.
as you said, to power structures. And it's like,
Yeah.
but the reason that there's the protection is with traditions is
Hmm.
like a structure for that. Like when you look at acting, like imagine all of the different things that Heath Ledger is accessing when he's performing the Joker, but in the context of a film set, versus if he was walking down the street that way, it would terrify people. And so you kind of have to understand the 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 frame, you know what I mean? Like you literally like you have to understand the framing, because the framing is what can give something meaning and structure and containment. And that's what the traditions, I think, provide, properly understood. When people access it, and what that's within that frame is incredibly valuable, but when you break that frame and you take it out of that, well, that's when it can become dangerous, right? Like you don't want people dressed as the Joker running around, in Central Park.
No,
Anyway.
I mean, beautiful. And the only thing I'll add to that is this idea. I mean, you're hit on stuff I talk about with people demonize religion. They're like, oh, I'm spiritual, but not religious. And it's like, those two things are so interconnected, like to try to think that we have a simplistic model of what some spirituality is and what religion is. I think a lot of people just have kind of a misunderstanding of both. But the way that I think about it and the way you just kind of framed it too is literally that framing, that religio, that which binds us to the practice. And now we can engage in these things that can arise. But what I think is interesting about Tantra, as opposed to the other Orthodox um, uh, frameworks or dogmas, is that I think Tantra builds into it this idea that that frame is the frame of today. That doesn't mean that's the frame of forever. It's a layered, there's always a breaking and a like it's like the 9 dot problem. It's like you try to solve the 9 dots and you're like, okay, I can't do it. But then when you put a bigger frame around it and you go outside the box, you can solve it.
Hmm.
And I always think of like that's how insight works. It's like you don't break it entirely, get rid of it, but you always have to draw a bigger box around whatever you currently have. It can't be too big. If you get rid of it completely, now you're just like you said, you're just you're in a space that doesn't it's not able to be contextualized. But if you can constantly like try to build out that practice or see that practice, it gives a space for those things to be birthed, but then that enhances to the next box, and so you're just constantly expanding, expanding, expanding. At
Yeah.
least the way that I, view at it. And Tantra to me has just been like the most. It's like a supercar. I mean, maybe an Agori would be higher, but Tantra seems like it's kind of like if you're really wanting to participate in that growth of in the enhancement of the boxes, uh, here's a method in which you can like build your boxes out or have your boxes expand a- at a much faster rate than maybe if you're just participating in other types of that's just
I think
how
that's
I've
great,
I've
and
kind of
I think
lent it.
there's an interesting corollary. You talked about religio. I mean, tantra itself basically means continuum or
Weaving.
thread or
Yeah.
weaving or yoke, right? And like
Yeah.
yoke appears in that passage that we were talking about from Matthew. And
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not a Catholic, but the Eucharist is like a Gana chakra, feast offering and so these parallels are there, and maybe they're just interesting parallels. But at the same time, I think that the people who, when they receive the Eucharist and have a spiritual experience, I think that that's what we're talking about. Like that's a way for people to understand that the thread, the continuum, the weaving together, the unity, the religio, the religamenting. That I don't think we always have to be like, oh, tantra is this scary thing over there, and I'm in this safe thing here. Like they need the under. That's what's so valuable about reading and studying and engaging interreligiously and intra-religiously.
Oh, I am starting to see more and more the threads of the gnosis, like path of gnosis with tantra, and this idea um of understanding that there's different levels that bleed within if a person will allow it like that. It's like tantra in the traditional sense to me is more of the the formalized understanding of it. But I think once you really like, and this is like I said, my interpretation of it is there's it's a mode of being. I mean, it's like it's not a formal religion. It's not like a like, oh, I'm tantric now. It's like no, it's like that's you're gonna have like levels of that gets played out. And I've seen people that weren't practicing it and had a tantric experience, like a very, so it's like I want to move it the same way that I think there was no pure Gnostics during the early church. No, there were. I'm sure there were that were like really in like into the cosmologies of it. But I think that was infused into a lot of the traditions, and so you have this infusion of stuff into these practices. And so that's the way I look at it with this. I'm like, I like what you said, like getting rid of the scary. I mean, it's first got to get out of the paradigm of just being about sex, especially within the Western mindset,
You're
because I
totally
think
incorrect.
that's for a
Yeah,
lot of people, it just lives in that space, and you're like, "I don't know if it's redeemable." Like, maybe it is, maybe not, we'll see. Uh, but nevertheless, I think this thing can exist without name. I think in a lot of ways it will exist even if a person calls it something else. It's gonna have the similar, characteristics there. So I love this conversation, and I really appreciated this because I feel like it just at the end of the day, it's not conclusive, it's just meant to say, here's another way of viewing it. Here's another idea around it, here's another experience around it, and that's what I really was hoping from this conversation. So you know I really appreciate you
I had a great time.
sharing your
I'm
insights.
sorry we went long, but I was really enjoying this, and I thought we touched on some, really fascinating and meaningful stuff, and I really appreciate you having me, and I agree with you. I think the more that people, read and study widely, like, sometimes people are afraid of other traditions, and I'm not trying to tell anybody to study tantra, but, like, my study of Christianity has made my Buddhist practice better. There's no question.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm so grateful to that. There's so many things that I learned from Christianity, so many things that Christians as a community do better
Yeah.
that I wish we Buddhists
Well,
would, and vice versa. Do you know what I mean? Like, and so I think it's when we can look at the wider world and other traditions as enriching,
a
getting caught
hundred
in these like
percent.
ridiculous sectarian
Yeah.
fights.
Well, I mean, I'll say it like this: I don't call myself a Christian, and I get called a heretic a lot too. But what's interesting is the more I dream about Shiva, the more love I have for Christ. It just throughout my entire journey, it's like I've had since walking away from the faith, I grow to see and love and appreciate Christ more than I ever did as when I was a part of the faith, and I think that's just interesting to me.
I
Like, it goes to exactly what you're
mhm.
saying. It's like, and you just have to challenge anybody to say like, um, you don't know until you give that space, you open up that space, and then you just see what happens and let the experience tell you and dictate like what ends up unfolding. Because everybody that I work with is, even if they come from the evangelical background, when they open up to a lot of these practices and dream work and depth psychology or like any of this stuff, same story. They end up having a deeper, more embodied, lived relationship with that in which they worshipped.
Yeah,
Now it's that in which they
I
embody.
and if they don't, then I would say that just shows that somebody's faith wasn't as strong as they thought it was, and that's not a negative thing. Like, if studying and engaging with other things doesn't enrich your life and your experience and your faith, then I think there's something that needs some work or tweaking. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, totally. Well, all right, Yuri, we'll wrap it up, man.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Trey.
I really enjoyed this, man, and we'll have to do it again.
I anytime you want, I would love to.
Awesome.